So over the past week, I've been looking into Kyle's abilities, working out his math to add to my build calculator website, and looking around on YouTube after, I've come to see that not only is everyone building him wrong, but everyone, including you, owes Kyle an apology. Because right now, nobody seems to realize this poor boy is bugged as fuck. And if they fix this bug, then he will shoot up to be as effective, if not better, than Lepic. Given the claims I just made, I am going to talk about the bug and how to build around this bug in the future if they fix it, before I talk about the other two builds that are functional at the time of this recording. And a quick side note, if they ever do fix this bug, I'll change the pinned comment to reflect this, so that way, if you're a future viewer, you'll know. Most of you probably know about Kyle for his Missile Man ability back when there was a huge exploit and he was doing like hundreds of millions of damage, superconductivity thrusters. He just flies around for a sec before ramming into an enemy and usually doing piss for damage, at least in these days, despite the ability having massive power modifiers. The ability can be pretty nice in niche scenarios, and we'll talk about how to min-max it in one of the later builds. But long overlooked is the ability augment or transcendent mod, whatever the fuck you want to call it. Superconductive bombing. Bombing converts the ability to do like 85% less damage on impact, which is an understandable turnoff for most people. But it also gives the ability to drop bombs while in flight, and the damage on paper doesn't seem to be that great, so a lot of people skip it and just say it's good for mobbing. And that's a load of shit. The phrasing on the ability breakdown is misleading as hell, as it says that it drains magnetic force, which is a custom resource, per bomb dropped. And everything else in there makes it sound like he only drops one bomb per interval, which is every 0.5 seconds. However, what it should say is that it is cost per bomb set, because it doesn't drop one bomb per interval, it drops 6. Also, the skill claims to have a duration of 6 seconds, but the flight windup is 1 second, and then the actual flight duration after the windup is about 7.8 seconds. And while that can't be modified by skill duration, although it would be amazing if it could, that means that so long as you have cost modifiers necessary to allow you to do this, then you will achieve a maximum of 15 sets of bombs dropped, meaning 90 total bombs over a period of 7.8 seconds. Sounds pretty fucking good, right? The only problem is that this augment is bugged. Every bomb has no actual power modifier, meaning they are doing exactly your skill power plus any bonus from power modifiers from your mods. So at base with no mods, each bomb is only doing about 12% of the damage that it should be. So, you know, to everyone who's tried the mod without attempting to work it out, what it does or what it should do, yeah, it sucks right now. But the second they fix that, Kyle stonks are going to go through the roof. And this is roughly how you would want to build him in such a future. I have no clue when they will get around to fixing this, I can only pray soon. But in the meantime, and moving on, Kyle remains the sad forgotten stepchild in the basement, so let's talk about how to build him via means that are at least functional right now, for which there are two. The first option is to just build into his one pump chump gameplay as we mentioned before, whereas the other is to pump your mouse DPI and go wild. I know that last one sounds kind of fucking stupid, but I promise it is legitimate. Starting with the one pump chump builds, there are 3 variants, but let's talk about magnetic force since it is a key factor in scaling the damage for this build. Kyle doesn't have MP. Instead, he has magnetic force, which is equal to 2 times your maximum shield value. It will never gain passively, and the only way to gain it is by using your first or second skill. The first skill bonks enemies and restores force equal to 30% of your max shield. That sounds like a lot until you realize that it is max shield, meaning that 30% of max shield is 15% of magnetic force, meaning it will take you 7 fucking skill casts in order to reach a max bar, and that is terrible. The second skill puts up a barrier that will give you force whenever you take hits on it. However, the amount gained is fucking non-existent, and while the barrier is up, your move speed is that of a dying turtle. In summary, both skills suck shit. But the second skill has an amazing augment that changes the barrier to no longer block projectiles, but instead damage and knock back enemies on contact while granting force per hit. And you'll notice that the skill, when this augment is equipped, says that there is a 50 hit limit. Why? Because not clarified very well is that the barrier deals damage for every instance of contact with an enemy. And for those who don't quite get the reason that's funny, what happens when you connect the barrier to an enemy that can't be knocked back, like a Colossus? This means that all 50 instances of damage are done almost instantaneously, doing a semi-decent bit of damage, while also completely filling your magnetic force bar. On both builds, and all their variants that we'll talk about next, you are going to be using this augment, and that is precisely why. It is insanely useful. With magnetic force covered though, let's talk about his fourth ability. Superconductivity thrusters literally just turns Kyle into a missile on impact, dealing quite a lot of damage, that scales both off of your skill power and modifiers, as well as your total magnetic force. So basically your skill power and your shields. The power part of your impact damage is your bread and butter standard damage equation, nothing too crazy there, I won't dwell on it. The magnetic part of the impact damage, however, is only scaled by more total magnetic force, which in turn just means more shield. And that damage is based off of the magnetic force owned on impact. So if you don't have a full bar when you hit, you are not going to do full damage. On that note though, the first build variant is the pure shield variant. Don't misunderstand, we are pumping skill power first by as much as we can. Skill power obviously has the largest modifier to work with here. So we're popping in Spear and Shield, non-attribute Sensitium, non-attribute Specialist, Dangerous Ambush, etc. But there's very few mods that can actually boost skill power ratios, and that's pretty much all of them that we can fit on Kyle that are also applicable. Afterwards, our only options are to either pump shield or skill power modifier, but power modifier does piss all here, since our base power modifier is massive, and any additions we would do are literally additive, meaning they're gonna do nothing. So the alternative is to pump shield, which is much more meaningful since shield has a not as large modifier, but still a pretty fucking huge one. So we pop on increased shield and HP conversion shield variant, and then I feel like a lot of people aren't talking about this enough, but overwhelming shield got a massive buff in one of the latest patches, bringing the HP conversion from 2% all the way to 26.8%, meaning 26.8% of your max HP gets converted to base shield, which can then be further buffed by all the percent shield buffs. So we put on overwhelming shield, and then we just pump HP as much as we can with increased HP and stim accelerant. After that, just make sure you get as high of rolls as you can regarding shields on the rest of your components, and health. So on your auxiliary, you want to get health. On your fucking processor, you want to get base shield, shield recovery. On your sensor, you want shields in or out of combat, and then on the memory as well. Anything that has to do with shields, take it. And for the set, it needs to be Slayer. I know Slayer doesn't have shield on every single main stat for their components, and some people are probably going to say you're better off running the 2 pieces of Slayer that give shield, and then the 2 pieces of Bravery that give shield, and then the 2-piece set bonus for Bravery will also give you more shield on top of that. But I promise you, that is a huge fucking damage loss. Slayer is the way to go. For your reactor, you obviously just want a non-attribute tech reactor for subs, Colossus attack, and then tech ratio boost. If you can get the reactor to use special rounds with the weapon being Secret Garden, since it can be a nice buff, but it's not mandatory. The catch is obviously that if you use Secret Garden, you have to get the buffs up before casting your ult. And that's not very easy to do on this build. It'll be much easier to do on the next build we'll talk about, but we'll get to that in a second. This version of the build is obviously going to be the most tanky of the 3 versions for 1 pump, sporting 25,000 shield and 20,000 defense, hitting for 7.5 million damage on a non-crit each impact. I said non-crit before factoring in enemy damage reductions. You're never gonna crit with this because Kyle has a base rate of 5%, but you really don't need to since you're doing a respectable amount of damage per impact. However, your cooldown will be atrocious, and because of that, your damage spread and DPS over a damage interval from skillcast to skillcast is going to be downright shit at 273,000 damage per second. You'll never have an issue getting your mag force up to full before casting due to Diamagnetic Bulwark's weird instant hits like we mentioned earlier, but you're going to have an enormous amount of downtime. And as such, I can't really recommend this build for solo or group play unless you really need more effective health. And that leads us to the next version of this, the shield, but also with cooldown build. Literally the same build as before, guys. The only difference is we swap out Spear and Shield along with amplification control and slot in MP conversion and nimble fingers for a hefty chunk of cooldown reduction. This does reduce our damage per impact on a non-crit by about 700,000, which might sound like a lot, but it isn't. And because of the cooldown reduction we just achieved, we more than double our DPS, bringing it up from 273,000 per second up to 610,000 per second. And that is of course not factoring Secret Garden if you got it. And on the note of Secret Garden, because you have better cooldowns, that means it is significantly easier to maintain Secret Garden stacks. All in all, extremely comfy build. You're still running with 23,000 shield and 10,000 defense with a much better DPS rate. Lastly is the pure crit variant. These are the mods you'd want to run with it, and while it is pretty funny because you see that you have the potential to crit for over 56 million damage before damage reductions, you'll also notice that your DPS drops to 319,000 damage per second. This is because Kyle has a base crit rate of 5% as mentioned before, and even with all the crit mods you might crit for 56 million, sure, but you have a 15% chance to actually pull it off, and then afterwards afterwards you're stuck with a 60-second downtime. I'm sure some other twat will clickbait you with some screenshot using this build against a level 1 enemy, put it on their thumbnail. But if you ever see someone do that, just let them know they're a genuine sack of shit. The only reason I show numbers like these is because they are the actual numbers before damage reductions are set in at all. They are accurate and useful to know. But anyone trying to show you how a build performs just by showing numbers in the laboratory is just trying to fucking bait you. In any case, none of the 3 one-pump build variants will ever come close to competing with the millions of DPS that Kyle will have if they ever fix bombing. But if you are one of the 3 Kyle mains out there and you wanted to know how to optimize your big PP numbers for now, these are your options on how you can manage it. The closing note on the one-pump builds is that you can use your third ability before entering Missile Man, and since its damage is also contingent upon the consumption of magnetic force, it will add a tiny bit of damage as a separate instance of damage on your impact, but just barely. Also, if you spend too long flying while your 3 is active because it actively drains magnetic force, that means you'll have less magnetic force on impact if you took too long, which will lessen the damage of your 4 by more than you would expect. So just be careful if you try to do that. And then the third and final build, the mouse DPI build. This build is actually fucking stupid. It's also pretty impractical for reasons I'll discuss later. But the DPS of this build exceeds 1.85 million in comparison to the amounts we've reached on other builds. That said, like we mentioned before when using Diamagnetic Bulwark to augment your second ability, it can nearly instantaneously get off the 50 hit limit against a Colossus since the Colossus can't be staggered or knocked back, and you can just wiggle your point of view to get the hits off. Because of this, we simply pump cooldown, power modifier, and skill power in that order of priority to ensure that we get the recast as soon as possible, as well as to get the power modifier as high as we can, since the base power modifier of 109.7 is fucking tiny and benefits immensely from any additive bonuses we can offer. Also, this math for Bulwark is done under the assumption that between the moment that you cast your 2 to the moment that it ends and the cooldown begins is 4 seconds long. Obviously, it can be much shorter than that, depending on how fast you wiggle your mouse. I just wanted to be conservative, and even being conservative nets us a 1.85 million DPS rate. And that's with ambush. If we take off ambush, then it's a 1.16 million DPS rate. While ridiculous, it is actually wildly effective, but there is one major drawback to that fuckery, and that is shield. While you go about looking like an epileptic child in front of your peers, the likelihood of you remaining undamaged is small. You're obviously going to take hits and lose shield, and since maintaining Bulwark requires shield for every second it is up, that does mean that eventually you will find yourself in a state where you do lose all your shield and can't recast, meaning you've yeed your last ha and your damage is done. To alleviate the inevitable shield decay, I do advise that you use your third ability whenever you can and as soon as it is off cooldown. If you don't, you are going to get utterly fucked, since this build is rocking 0 survivability. Maintaining the mag force required in order to keep your 3 up is not an issue, due to the many hits that you're going to get off with Bulwark. But just remember that your 3 does have a duration limit. It is not a toggle, it is a cast. And because of that, it can't be held indefinitely, so you will still get hit every now and then. After this video goes out, I'll be adding all the Kyle math to my public build calculator website, so if you want to fiddle with things yourself and make a build for a very specific scenario, you can do that. For what it is worth, I do not run ads on my website because I'm not a bitch. And then with that, I think I am done. At the time of this recording, he really does suck shit, sure. But if they ever fix that, you're all gonna have to shut the fuck up about how bad he is. And to the 4 or 5 people who asked for a Kyle build, I hope you're happy, because this sure as shit was not worth it. I want my forma back.